Here's something most Canadians never learned in school. During World War II, German submarines hunted ships right off Canada's coastline, torpedoing vessels so close to shore that families could see the explosions from their kitchen windows. Bodies washed up on beaches where children played. Oil slicks blackened the water for miles. And the government, they tried desperately to keep it all secret. This is the story of when the war came to Canada, when Nazi U-boats turned the St. Lawrence River and the Atlantic coast into hunting grounds, and when ordinary Canadians found themselves living on the front lines of a conflict that was supposed to be happening an ocean away. May 11, 1942. A calm spring night on the St. Lawrence River near Rimouski, Quebec. The British freighter Nicoya was making its way upstream, carrying a cargo of sugar, steel, and aluminum. The crew felt safe. They were in Canadian waters now, hundreds of miles from the open Atlantic. The war was somewhere else, happening to other people in distant places. Then at 10:30 that evening, a massive explosion tore through the ship's hull. Water rushed in. The vessel lurched violently to one side. In the chaos and darkness, 12 men died. The Nicoya sank in just 18 minutes. The survivors, pulled from the freezing water, kept asking the same question over and over. How? How could a German submarine be here, in the heart of Canada, in a river where families went fishing and children swam in summer? The answer was simple and terrifying. Germany had brought the war to Canada's doorstep, and they'd done it with ruthless efficiency. Let me take you back a few months earlier. When Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941, German Admiral Karl Dönitz saw an opportunity. He called it Operation Drumbeat. The idea was brilliant in its brutality. Send submarines to the North American coast where merchant ships sailed without convoy protection, where coastal cities blazed with light at night, where nobody expected an attack. It would be like shooting fish in a barrel. The first U-boats arrived off the American coast in January 1942, and the slaughter began immediately. Ships silhouetted against the bright lights of New York, Miami, and Atlantic City became easy targets. In the first 6 months of 1942, German submarines sank over 400 ships along the American coast. The water turned black with oil. Bodies floated among the debris. Beach resorts became rescue stations. And the whole time, Dönitz was looking further north, toward Canada. Canada's maritime provinces and the St. Lawrence River represented something strategically vital. This was the gateway to the heart of North America. Every ship carrying war materials from the industrial centers of Ontario and Quebec had to pass through these waters. Iron ore from the mines, grain from the prairies, manufactured goods from the factories. All of it funneled through this maritime corridor. If Germany could cut this supply line, they could cripple the Allied war effort. In April 1942, German submarine U-553, commanded by Carl Thurman, entered Canadian waters. Thurman was experienced, calculating, and he knew exactly what he was hunting. On the night of May 11th, he found the Nicoya. One torpedo was all it took, but Thurman wasn't finished. The next night he spotted another target, the Dutch freighter Lido. Another torpedo, another ship gone, 12 more men dead. 2 nights, 2 ships, 24 dead sailors, and suddenly Canada's sense of security shattered like glass. The Canadian Navy scrambled to respond, but here's what most people don't understand about Canada's military situation in 1942. The country was desperately unprepared. When the war started in 1939, Canada's Navy was tiny, just a handful of ships and a few thousand sailors. By 1942, it had grown rapidly, but growth isn't the same as readiness. Many of the ships were old. The crews were green, inexperienced boys barely out of training. Anti-submarine equipment was scarce and often outdated. Radar was primitive when it existed at all. The Navy was trying to protect thousands of miles of coastline and one of the world's busiest shipping lanes with resources stretched impossibly thin. And the U-boats kept coming. U-132 arrived in June. Commander Ernst Vogelsang positioned his submarine near the Gaspé Peninsula, and over 3 weeks he sank or damaged 6 ships. The Norwegian freighter Endure Elizabeth went down. the Greek cargo ship Mount Pindus, the British freighter Dinard. Each attack followed the same horrifying pattern: a quiet night, sailors going about their duties, maybe thinking about home, about families, about survival. Then a streak in the water, an explosion. Fire, screaming, chaos. Those who made it to lifeboats faced hours or days in cold northern waters, hoping rescue would come before hypothermia or drowning claimed them. But here's where the story takes a turn that still makes historians shake their heads. The Canadian government decided to keep these attacks largely secret from the public. Think about that for a moment. Enemy submarines were operating in Canadian waters, sinking ships within sight of shore, killing sailors and civilians, and the government chose not to tell people the full truth. The official explanation was preventing panic and maintaining morale, but the real reason ran deeper. Admitting that German submarines could operate freely in Canadian waters would be admitting that the Navy couldn't protect its own coastline. It would damage public confidence. It might affect recruitment, war bond sales, industrial production. So the censors went to work. Newspapers received strict guidelines about what they could and couldn't report. When ships sank, the stories were buried on inside pages or omitted entirely. Casualty numbers were downplayed. The government issued reassuring statements while behind closed doors, officials panicked. Meanwhile, people living in coastal communities knew something was wrong. They saw the oil slicks. They heard the explosions echoing across the water at night. They watched rescue ships racing out to sea. They found debris on their beaches. In some communities, bodies washed ashore. You can't keep secrets like that, not really. Rumors spread faster than any official announcement. Fear took root and grew in the absence of honest information. September 6, 1942. The passenger ferry SS Caribou was making its regular overnight crossing from North Sydney, Nova Scotia, to Port aux Basques, Newfoundland. This wasn't a military vessel. This was civilian transportation, carrying 237 people including women and children, families returning home, workers traveling for jobs, ordinary people living their ordinary lives in extraordinary times. Among the passengers was Leonard Shears, traveling with his wife and their 2 young sons, aged 6 and 8. There was Margaret Broom, a nursing sister heading to her posting. Dozens of others whose names and stories filled the passenger manifest. The Caribou had a naval escort, the minesweeper HMCS Grandmere, which should have provided some measure of protection. But U-69, commanded by Ulrich Greff, was lurking in Cabot Strait. Greff watched through his periscope as the ferry approached. He knew this was a civilian vessel. The rules of war, even in 1942, supposedly protected such ships. Greff fired anyway. The torpedo struck at 3:30 in the morning. Most passengers were asleep. The explosion tore through the ship's hull, and the Caribou began sinking immediately. People woke to darkness, confusion, freezing water rushing in. Parents grabbed for their children. Crew members tried to launch lifeboats in the chaos. The ship went down in just 5 minutes. 5 minutes from a warm bed to the black, freezing waters of the North Atlantic. HMCS Grandmere attempted to rescue survivors, but in the darkness and rough seas, it was nearly impossible. Of the 237 people aboard the Caribou, only 101 survived. Among the dead were 31 children. Leonard Shears lost both his young sons. Margaret Broom, the nursing sister, drowned trying to help others into lifeboats. Entire families were wiped out. This time the government couldn't suppress the story. This wasn't a nameless freighter crewed by foreign sailors. This was Canadians, families, children killed on a regular ferry route. The outrage was immediate and overwhelming. How could this happen? Where was the Navy? Why weren't these waters protected? The censors tried to control the narrative, but grief and anger can't be censored. The sinking of the Caribou became a turning point, not militarily, but psychologically. Canadians realized the war wasn't somewhere far away anymore. It was right here, killing their neighbors, their children, their friends. And still, the U-boats continued their deadly work. In October 1942, U-106 under Herman Rasch patrolled off Newfoundland. 2 more ships sunk. U-518 arrived in November, 3 more vessels sent to the bottom. The Canadian Navy was doing everything it could with what it had, but hunting submarines in the vast North Atlantic was like searching for needles in a very cold, very deadly haystack. Anti-submarine warfare was still primitive. Sonar was unreliable. Depth charges had to be dropped almost on top of a submarine to be effective. And the U-boat commanders were experienced hunters who knew how to exploit every weakness in Canada's defenses. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough: the psychological toll on the merchant sailors. These were civilians, not soldiers. They signed up to transport cargo, not to be targets in a shooting gallery. Every voyage became an exercise in terror. Loading cargo in port, sailors would joke nervously about whether they'd make it to the destination. At sea, they scanned the horizon constantly, searching for periscopes. At night, they barely slept, lying in their bunks knowing that a torpedo could tear through the hull at any moment. Many ships sailed without proper escort protection. The crews knew they were vulnerable. They sailed anyway because the war effort depended on them, because their families needed the income, because somebody had to do it. The bravery of those merchant sailors, facing death trip after trip for barely any recognition, stands as one of the war's largely untold stories. By early 1943, the Battle of the St. Lawrence was becoming unsustainable. The Canadian government made a controversial decision. They closed the St. Lawrence River to overseas shipping. All transatlantic convoys would now terminate and originate from Halifax instead of Montreal. It was a humiliating admission of defeat. Germany's submarines had effectively closed Canada's primary maritime gateway, but it was also pragmatic. The St. Lawrence was simply too dangerous, too difficult to defend. The narrow waters gave U-boats perfect hunting conditions while making anti-submarine operations nearly impossible. Better to consolidate defenses around Halifax, where the Navy had more resources and better infrastructure. The focus shifted to the open Atlantic approaches to Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. This was where the real battle would be won or lost. Convoys leaving Halifax carried the materials Britain desperately needed to survive: food, fuel, weapons, ammunition. Every ship that made it through was a victory. Every ship that went down was a strategic loss multiplied by the human tragedy. Canadian corvettes, those small, uncomfortable, but remarkably tough warships, escorted the convoys. The crews endured conditions that were barely survivable: storms, ice, mountainous waves, cold so intense that spray froze on the decks and equipment, and always the knowledge that somewhere below the surface U-boats were hunting. But slowly, gradually, the tide was turning. New technology was reaching Canadian forces: better radar that could detect surface submarines, more effective sonar, improved depth charges, long-range patrol aircraft that could spot U-boats and force them to submerge, limiting their effectiveness. The Allies were also beginning to crack German naval codes, giving convoy commanders advance warning of U-boat positions. Training improved, tactics evolved. The inexperienced crews of 1942 were becoming hardened veterans by 1943. U-boat crews, meanwhile, were facing their own nightmare. Early in the war, submarine duty was dangerous but offered reasonable odds of survival. By 1943, those odds were plummeting. Allied anti-submarine forces were sinking U-boats at an alarming rate. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in Germany's submarine force during World War II, approximately 30,000 died. Think about that statistic: a 75% death rate. Going to sea in a U-boat was nearly a suicide mission. Yet these men continued to do it, driven by duty, by propaganda, by the same complex mix of courage and ideology that motivated soldiers on all sides. The attacks on Canada's coast continued through 1943 and into 1944, but with decreasing frequency and success. U-190 patrolled off Newfoundland in late 1944, but by then, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. Germany was losing the war. Resources were stretched. The best submarine commanders were dead. Allied defenses had become too strong. The Battle of the St. Lawrence and the U-boat war on Canada's coast was effectively over, not because Germany stopped trying, but because they no longer could succeed. When the war ended in May 1945, the final tally was sobering. German U-boats had sunk 25 vessels in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the St. Lawrence River between 1942 and 1944. Hundreds of sailors and civilians died. The economic cost ran into hundreds of millions of dollars. The strategic impact was significant, forcing Canada to reorganize its entire maritime supply system. But perhaps the greatest impact was psychological. Canadians had entered the war believing the fighting would happen somewhere else. The U-boat attacks destroyed that illusion. The war had come home, literally to their doorstep, and for communities along the East Coast, the trauma lingered for generations. What's remarkable is how this story faded from Canadian memory. In the decades after the war, the Battle of the St. Lawrence became a footnote, barely mentioned in history books, rarely discussed in schools. Perhaps it was too uncomfortable, this reminder of vulnerability. Perhaps other stories seemed more heroic, more fitting for national mythology. Canadian soldiers fighting in Europe, pilots in the Battle of Britain, these were the stories that got told and retold. The merchant sailors who died in Canadian waters, the naval crews who struggled to defend the coastline with inadequate resources, the civilians who lived in fear, their stories were quietly forgotten by everyone except those who lived through it. In recent years, historians have been working to recover these lost narratives. Memorial services now honor the victims of the Caribou and other vessels. Museums in Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Newfoundland have exhibits about the U-boat attacks. Survivors and their families have shared their testimonies, ensuring the memories don't disappear completely. Archaeological surveys have located some of the wrecks, time capsules on the sea floor holding the physical evidence of those terrible days. One of the most poignant discoveries came from the wreck of the Caribou. Divers exploring the site found children's toys, personal belongings, the ordinary objects of ordinary lives interrupted by war. There's something uniquely heartbreaking about seeing a child's shoe on the ocean floor, knowing the story behind it, understanding the terror and confusion of those final moments. The men who commanded the U-boats that attacked Canada, most didn't survive the war. Carl Thurman, who sank the Nicoya, was killed in 1943 when his submarine was destroyed by Allied aircraft. Ulrich Greff, who torpedoed the Caribou, survived the war but spent years in Allied prisoner of war camps. Ernst Vogelsang was captured when his submarine was sunk in 1942. These men were following orders, fighting for their country, but their actions left scars on Canadian communities that never fully healed. For the survivors, life after these attacks was complicated. Many merchant sailors refused to go back to sea, unable to face the terror again. Others continued sailing, driven by economic necessity or stubborn determination. Some developed what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in the 1940s such conditions were poorly understood and rarely treated. They had nightmares. They startled at loud noises. They couldn't shake the memories of drowning comrades, of burning oil, of desperate hours in freezing lifeboats hoping for rescue. But they were expected to just carry on, to be grateful they survived, to not talk about it too much because the war was over and everyone wanted to move forward. The families who lost loved ones in the attacks faced their own challenges. Death benefits for merchant sailors were minimal compared to military personnel. Widows struggled financially. Children grew up without fathers. Communities lost men who would have been teachers, fishermen, shopkeepers, fathers, and grandfathers. The absences echoed through generations. And because these deaths weren't celebrated as heroic military sacrifice, because they happened in this strange middle ground between civilian tragedy and military loss, the grief was sometimes unacknowledged, the sacrifices unrecognized. There's a small cemetery in Port aux Basques, Newfoundland, where some of the Caribou victims are buried. For decades it was just another cemetery, the graves marked but largely unvisited except by family. In recent years, people have started making pilgrimages there, laying wreaths, taking photographs, trying to connect with this history. It's become a place of remembrance, a physical space where the forgotten story is slowly being remembered. The Canadian Navy learned hard lessons from the U-boat attacks. After the war, anti-submarine warfare became a core focus. Canada invested heavily in new technologies, better training, improved coordination with allies. The country that had been caught so unprepared in 1942 became one of the world's leaders in anti-submarine operations during the Cold War. The institutional memory of those desperate years shaped naval doctrine for decades. Every Canadian sailor trained in anti-submarine tactics was, in some sense, learning from the mistakes and sacrifices of 1942 through 1944. What strikes me most about this story, after spending years researching it, is the ordinariness of the victims. These weren't soldiers who had trained for combat and accepted the risks. They were people trying to live their lives in the middle of a global catastrophe. The mother taking her children on a ferry. The merchant sailor just trying to earn a living. The families living in coastal towns who never imagined war would arrive on their beaches. Their stories remind us that war doesn't only happen on battlefields. It happens in ordinary places to ordinary people who find themselves caught up in events far beyond their control. The last U-boat patrol in Canadian waters occurred in early 1945, just weeks before Germany's surrender. By then, the outcome of the war was clear. But that submarine crew still went to sea, still hunted for targets, still followed their orders into what they must have known was a losing cause. War has its own terrible momentum, pushing people forward even when reason says to stop. On both sides of this conflict, people kept fighting, kept dying, kept sacrificing long after the outcome was determined. That's one of war's cruelest truths. Today, if you stand on the coast of Nova Scotia or Quebec or Newfoundland and look out at the Atlantic, the water looks peaceful. Fishing boats come and go. Cargo ships pass in the distance. Tourists take photographs. But underneath that peaceful surface lies a graveyard. 25 ships rest on the bottom, along with the men who went down with them. Their bones have long since dissolved into the sea, but the steel remains, slowly corroding artificial reefs now home to fish and marine life. Nature has reclaimed these sites, transforming instruments of death into cradles of life. There's something poetic about that, though it doesn't erase the tragedy. The story of the U-boat attacks on Canada is ultimately about vulnerability and resilience. It's about the moment when Canadians realized their geographic isolation couldn't protect them. About communities that faced terror and carried on. About sailors who kept going to sea despite knowing the risks. About a government that struggled to protect its people with inadequate resources. About enemies who were also human beings caught in their own nation's madness. It's a complicated story without easy heroes or simple villains, which is probably why it's been easier to forget than to remember. But we shouldn't forget. These events happened. These people lived and died. Their experiences were real, their fear was real, their courage was real. By remembering them, by telling their stories, we acknowledge that the cost of war extends far beyond battlefields and casualty statistics. War came to Canada's doorstep 80 years ago, and the people who lived through it deserve to be remembered not as footnotes, but as what they were, ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances with whatever courage and resilience they could muster. That's the legacy of those years when U-boats prowled Canadian waters and brought the war home.